My name is Cindy Maxey. I am with the Shaker Heights Public Library, and I'm really happy to welcome you this evening to the first of 4 programs in our series Shaker Engagement with the 1619 Project. The series of programs is a collaboration between the library and New One Shaker. And so this evening we are going to start with a presentation by Dr. Valerie Lee on the literature of slavery and the literary response to slavery. We have programs coming up later on the racial wealth gap and schools, American schooling, and on democracy itself and the contributions of African Americans to the creation of a democratic society. And then a final program where we're just going to talk about where we came from and where we're going to, how we build a better future, a more inclusive future. I am very pleased right now to introduce Ms. Angel Michelle Chapman. Angel is a legally trained nonprofit leader, HR professional, and business consultant, and she serves as executive director for New One Shaker, a community-based nonprofit organization focused on educational equity and creating relationships, systems, and structures that enable students and families to improve their educational and life outcomes. Additionally, Angel serves on the Shaker Heights PTO Council, and she's a Shaker alumna, parent, and grandparent, making her passion and commitment to the success of the Shaker community even more relevant. Angel's academic credentials include a Juris Doctor from Florida A&M University College of Law and a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice from North Carolina A&T State University. We are going to show a brief video that's an overview of the 1619 project created last year by the New York Times. And then it's about 14 minutes. When that's over, Angel will be introducing Dr. Lee.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get our video started. One moment.
Let me intercept real quick to say that you will see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Any point you've got questions for Dr. Lee, please put them in the Q&A, and after her talk, I'll be giving those questions to her to answer in the last half hour of our program.
They say our people were born on the water. The teal eternity of the Atlantic Ocean had severed them so completely that it was as if nothing had ever existed before, that everything they ever knew had simply vanished from the earth. I grew up in the Midwest. I really saw the landscape of inequality through my school bus windows. The houses started getting nicer, the streets were repaired. And I just remember that the narrative about Black people just did not match what I saw in my daily life. I would sit in the classroom and feel that Black people had never done anything except to be owned by white people. My high school had a one semester African American Studies course taught by the first and only Black male teacher I ever had. One of the books that he put in my hand said that the first Africans arrived in 1619. And I just remember I'd never heard that year before. And I knew that that was intentional. That erasure was powerful. I don't think that we tend to think of national memory as something that's intentionally created. We know about the Pilgrims. We know about George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. 1776, that sets in motion the founding of what would be the most liberatory democratic experiment in the history of the world. We were a country based on these freedoms, and that these freedoms are shared by all Americans. Well, the only way that you can believe that this country was the most liberatory, democratic nation that the world has ever seen is to, of course, erase the indigenous people who were already here. You, of course, have to ignore the enslaved Africans who arrived in the colony of Virginia in 1619, only 12 years after the English landed Jamestown. We're taught very, very little about slavery.
In 8th grade, we debunked the myth that slavery caused the Civil War. Instead, we learned the Southern states felt as though their rights were being encroached on by the Northern states.
The vast majority of high school kids don't even know that the Civil War was fought over slavery.
I couldn't believe the worksheet referred to enslaved people as African workers.
In the 5th grade, I was one of 3 Black girls in the class, and all 3 of us were assigned to be slaves during a presentation.
In 7th grade, my teacher announced that the Civil War had absolutely nothing to do with slavery.
All wars are fought for economic reasons.
We largely erase those narratives from the story and therefore say that those stories are not important in the America that we ultimately became. But you can look across modern American life, America today, and see that almost nothing is untouched by the legacy of slavery. Of course, the easy ones are things like the criminal justice system, where we know Black Americans are disproportionately represented. But what we don't think about is that slavery and the anti-Black racism that comes out of it has also led us to be the most carceral nation in the world. Why don't we have universal health care? Why do we have the shortest maternity leave, lowest minimum wage, lowest labor union membership? Support for social safety net programs declines amongst white voters if they think large numbers of Black people will benefit from them. Highway systems in areas that had significant numbers of Black Americans were largely designed to divide white communities off from Black communities. So when you're sitting in traffic, wasting your time, and you're our legal system is rife with laws that explicitly discriminate against Black Americans, and now in many ways implicitly. Our educational system is clearly a system that comes out of anti-Black racism.
Schools that have resources are unsurprisingly majority white.
If you really look, there's virtually nothing that you can see in this country that has not been touched by this legacy, but we have chosen not to really look. We have to tell the truth. And I think this country owes a great debt to Black Americans for actually forcing, often through their blood, through their death, through their martyrdom, this country to try to live up to its democratic ideals. It wasn't merely an idea on paper, but it was something that had to be made manifest for all people. Black people have been the true perfecters of democracy. Black people were the original abolitionists. Black people who are coming out of slavery are pushing for America's first civil rights law, which gets passed in 1866. The 14th Amendment is what gives us birthright citizenship. Formerly enslaved people push for universal rights of citizenship, never just arguing for their own rights. Black Americans are being drafted and volunteering to go to war, fighting for democracy abroad, and then coming back home and fighting for democracy here in America. With the second civil rights movement in the 60s, these laws are not just saying you cannot discriminate against Black Americans. They're saying you can't discriminate against anyone based on their race, nationality, gender, or based on their national origin. Black people also, because of our unique circumstance, created the only truly original American culture here: jazz, blues, gospel, and hip hop. Black slang becomes this universal language of cool. So much of the story of Black America is tragic. But when you look at that resilience, that ability to adapt and to make something beautiful again and again, I think that is amongst our greatest contributions to this country as well.
Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I get in my dream.
The 1619 Project is a massive endeavor by the New York Times to fundamentally reshape the way that we see the American story. What does it mean to be a country that was actually based on slavery? What would it mean for us if we consider 1619 our true origin and not 1776? That you can't separate these two the way that we have been taught both in history and in the American mind. It is a part of who we are. When I pitched the project, I knew, and really everyone working on the project knew, that it was important that the descendants of American slavery be the main people who were telling this story. Part of this getting to the truths of America was to take control of the narrative. To be able to produce something that in some ways counters so much of the history of the way that the New York Times told these stories in the past, and to take the reins of an institution that for much of its history helped with the marginalization of Black Americans, and to tell this story here. I think everyone understood how important that was.
I can't think of any project that we've undertaken since I've been here that had more intrinsic importance than what we were working on with this project. We wanted this issue and these ideas to reach as many people as possible.
So we did that with an entire special issue of the magazine. There was a special broadsheet, a podcast, thinking about what they went through. And we've been doing live events.
We didn't stop there, though, printing hundreds of thousands of extra copies of the issue, aggressively distributing in communities and to readers who are not customary recipients of the New York Times Magazine.
When we published it, I had no idea how it would land into the world. It caused me a great deal of anxiety, and I understood very strongly that if it published and no one cared, it would make it that much harder for the next Black or brown person behind me to pitch something really ambitious and get the green light. All of a sudden, I started seeing all of the social traffic, people asking, where can I get a copy? It's sold out. I've gone to 10 grocery stores and bodegas and the Starbucks, and I can't find it anywhere.
The New York Times Magazine is
marking 400 years since the first African.
Welcome to the Daily Show.
All of that was surprising to me.
She's a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and author of the 1619 Project.
The way that educators have embraced the project has been really, truly shocking and really the most fulfilling thing to me. We know that it's being taught in every state. There are 7 school districts that have made it mandatory high school curriculum. And I remember the first time I gave a talk at a high school in Chicago, and this young man wrote his own essay in response to my American democracy essay. And afterwards, he came up and told me that he had never felt like he could call himself an American before. And now he feels like he can. Sorry. I just think about how demeaned I felt as a child by what we were taught. And if this project can help other Black and brown children not to have to feel that way, then I will have done far more than I ever thought possible. So we are as American or more American than anyone else. No one has a right to deny us that. We certainly shouldn't deny it of ourselves.
Wow. Wow. I know a lot of us are probably saying wow right now. Well, I have the honor and the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Valerie Lee. Dr. Lee is a professor emerita and former vice provost and vice president of The Ohio State University, where she was the chair of 3 different departments. Her tenure department, the Department of English, as well as a former chair of the Department of Women's Studies and chair of the Department of African American and African Studies. An interdisciplinary scholar, Dr. Lee has held courtesy appointments in comparative studies, the Institute for Folklore Studies, and the Center for Interdisciplinary Law and Policy Studies. She is the author of several books and scores of journal articles, including a forthcoming book from the State University of New York Press titled Sister Locking Discourse, Reflections on Race and Gender in the 21st Century Academy. Dr. Lee is also the recipient of Ohio State's highest teaching award and its service award, and is a former chair of the national organization, the Association of Departments of English. She lives in Columbus, Ohio with her husband, attorney James C. Lee, who was a 1969 graduate of Shaker Heights High School. Isn't that amazing? So we definitely have the right person kicking off our Shaker Heights engagement of the 1619 project. Dr. Lee, take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation to speak with you this evening. I never say no to libraries. When I was a little girl growing up in Southern Maryland, I remember the first time that Blacks were allowed to enter the new library. I sat down and read everything in the young adult section, and I read more. I even convinced my mother to buy me the whole Nancy Drew series, The Hidden Staircase, The Secret of the Old Clock, The Mystery at Lilac Inn. So yes, I'm a reader, and yes, I grew up to become a professor of literature. Therefore, my entry into 1619 is through the eyes of African-American writers, essayists, poets, playwrights, and novelists. African-American writers are the ones who help to place flesh on the skeleton of what historians recorded. It is our writers who give soul to 1619, some of whom stepped off of those ships themselves, and some who reimagine that experience in a way such that it still resonates with us today. So what I want to do, I want you to see some of these authors and I want you to see their words. So I'm going to try to share a PowerPoint that I made for the audience. Now, I'm from the pre-Zoom era, so I hope I can do this right. I'll try to share the screen. And voila, I think I have it. And those are the positions that, yes, I held before retirement. But the first writer, can everyone hear me? And you can see my slides?
Yes, we can hear you and see the slides.
Oh, okay, good. So the first writer here is Phyllis Wheatley, and she was actually born in West Africa and brought over on a ship named Phyllis. So her master probably, of course, named her after the ship. She came over when she was around 7 or 8 years old. She was a Black female slave in 18th century New England. Many times people think that all the slaves were in the southern states, but Phyllis was dropped off in Boston to a prominent family in Boston. Sometimes the slaves who were really frail and sick, as Phyllis was, were dropped off in other places if the shipmaster didn't think they could actually do the hard work in the South. So this little frail little girl was dropped off in Boston, and she decided to write a book. In fact, she was the first African American to publish a book. She decided to become a poet, and you may think, oh, well, that's not a big deal. But yes, that was a very big deal, because at that time, people did not think that enslaved Africans had the ability, had a creative genius. They felt that creativity and the writing and poetry and literature was reserved for high society, for civilized societies. And here was this young, frail little girl who started to write these poems. So it was a big deal. Later on, some of our other writers addressed this whole issue of what it takes for an enslaved African to create literature. Paul Laurence Dunbar, for instance, has this poem where he says, I know why the caged bird sings. You know, I know what it means for a person to be enslaved and still try to create a literature. Another poet in the Harlem Renaissance, Conte Cullen, has this poem called Yet Do I Marvel. And in his poem, he talks about all the things that are perplexing. But the most perplexing thing, he says in his sonnet that ends with the couplet, yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. So Phyllis Wheatley was one of these poets, a Black poet, and she could write. I have the poem there for you. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. So she wrote poems using the conventions of the day because she was well versed in Greek and Latin conventions and in the classics. I know that the poem reads as if she had totally bought the idea that slavery was good for her. But you see the subversive sting in the last line of a poem where it says, remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. She's reminding her audience that many of whom thought there was a white heaven and a black heaven, that blacks too can participate in a heaven. So that's Phyllis Wheatley. And then we have here slave narratives. And of course, one of the earliest of American literary genres is indeed the slave narrative. And I have pictures on the screen of two of the most famous persons, one male and one female, who wrote slave narratives. Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. When she wrote it, she used the pseudonym of Linda Brent. And what she wrote about, and if you haven't read this book, you really should read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Harriet Jacobs, scholarship has proven that she wrote it herself. And she writes about the sexual exploitation during slavery, because when she became 15, she had this master who hounded her day and night. And she didn't want to lose her virtue, as she writes it, but he was on her day and night, and she wouldn't give in to him. Finally, what she did decide to do was to give herself to this other white lawyer who she felt would be nicer to children if they were to have children, and she did end up having 2 children by him. So it's like the lesser of 2 evils. I don't want to give away the whole story, but this man the master who was after her, was in relentless pursuit of her, so that she hid for 7 years in the little crawl space in her grandmother's house. She could see her children, but they couldn't see her. And I won't tell you what happens in that narrative, because I really want you to read it. So Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And most of you probably already know of Frederick Douglass, because his fame is still well known today. And I just simply have written some of the passages that he is famous for. He wrote a number of passages about slavery because, of course, he escaped slavery when he fled from a very cruel overseer and became one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement and a great statesman in and of himself. His slave narrative is called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It sold over 30,000 copies in the first 5 years. Actually, slaves wrote hundreds of narratives, and many people don't realize that particular detail. But the passages read, "No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." So this idea that we are all interconnected, that racism hurts everyone, that slavery hurt everyone. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. I know that a lot of Black men's retreats have that as their motto. And then a line that I really like, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." And then next I have a very famous person from the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. His American Heartbreak. "I am the American heartbreak, the rock on which freedom stumped its toe, the great mistake that Jamestown made long ago." So you have here in this very small stanza what the video 1619 was all about, what that project is all about. And so you have Langston Hughes asking, what happens when you build a democratic body and you bed within that body a cancer called slavery? What happens when America stumps her toe on Plymouth Rock? Who could have guessed than what we know now about the duration, the severity, and the legacy of slavery when you're talking about over 400 years. So this is what Hughes has to say about the 1619 events, the stumping of her toe. And the video pointed out that Abraham Lincoln said, the troublesome presence in our American democracy is slavery. And Langston Hughes is able to capture that in that very short poem. And then another poem by Langston Hughes. I could have given all kinds of poems by Langston Hughes, but this one, The Negro Speaks a River, answers the question, what does Hughes have to say about Black people with roots going all the way back to all the mighty rivers, the Congo, the Nile, and yes, the Mississippi? It's a poem about how Black bodies, people of African descent, built civilizations around rivers. The Negro speaks of rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusty rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. And then Langston Hughes also has another poem, and this particular poem is called I Too. In this particular poem, he's actually writing back to a well-known American poet, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman has a poem that says, I hear America singing. And in that poem, Walt Whitman is asked, well, what do you hear, Walt Whitman? And he says, oh, well, I hear the carpenter, and I hear the mason, I hear the boatman, I hear the young wife at work. He hears all these voices singing one beautiful song, but he doesn't mention Black people in it. So Langston Hughes comes along in the Harlem Renaissance and says, well, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. So here you have this poem where America is a mother, and she is a mother with favorites. She's playing favorites. She has one child that she showcases and one child that she hides. There is obviously this racial divide that the poem is talking about. It's talking about a subculture kept in shadows and closets, a second class. But notice at the end of the poem, Langston Hughes was very prophetic when he said, one day they'll see how beautiful I am. And for many of you, you will hear in those words how during the civil rights movement of the 60s, the refrains, I'm Black and beautiful. So Langston Hughes was very prophetic in that sense. And then in the next poem, I'm going to share with you one last poem by Langston Hughes. And this one, he assumes the voice of a child. And I like these poems that assume the voice of children, because how does one help a child understand discrimination, slavery, and its aftermath of Jim Crow? How does one teach that to a child? You know, how do you have that kind of talk with a child? This is a poem about a little child who has grown up in the South, and has now gone north, but still has that Southern mentality that tells him that he has to always go to the back. Where is the Jim Crow section on this merry-go-round, mister? Because I want to ride. Down south where I come from, white and colored can't sit side by side. Down south on the train, there's a Jim Crow car. On the bus, we're put in the back, but there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. Where's the horse for a kid that's black? So this kind of innocence for a child who is honestly perplexed. If you are used to sitting in the back of a bus and then you see this merry-go-round, where's the back to a merry-go-round? Of course, the poem is showing the absurdity of the Jim Crow laws and everything that followed slavery. There are other poems in African American literature from a child's perspective that are equally piercing. Conte Cullen, one of the contemporaries of Langston Hughes, has a poem called Incident, and it's just a stanza also. And it's about how when he first went to Baltimore as a child, the only thing he remembers is that someone called him the N-word. And that's the whole poem. Another poem from the point of view of a child is by Margaret Walker, who during the height of the civil rights movement, she overheard one little girl tell another little girl a particular statement that became the epigraph to a Margaret Walker poem called Street Demonstration. And what she overheard was this: "Hurry up, Lucille, or we will miss our chance to go to jail." And so, once again, a child's understanding of what everything was all about. And then we have here Robert Hayden, and his poem that he's most famous for is a history poem, by the way, that's called Middle Passage. And it's about the rebellion aboard the slave ship Amistad. By the way, he did his graduate studies at the University of Michigan. And even though I bleed scarlet and gray, I will give Michigan its due. So he was a Wolverine for a while. But the poem that I'm sharing from Robert Hayden is a poem about Frederick Douglass. And I won't take time to read this whole poem, but what I like about the poem is that it emphasizes how long Blacks have had to live with this legacy of slavery. So right now it's 400 years. And in this poem, Robert Hayden says, "When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth." And then I'm dropping down. "When it is more than the gaudy mumbo jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglass, this former slave, this Negro, beaten to his knees, exile, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien, this man superb in love and logic." So it's when you read the whole poem, it's a poem about the course of history. And when I read it, it reminds me of the statement from Martin Luther King Jr., "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And then next, another one of my favorite writers, Gwendolyn Brooks, who was born in Topeka, Kansas in 1917, but spent most of her life in Chicago. She writes about the ugliness of racism, classism, sexism. In 1950, she won the Pulitzer Prize. So much of where we are today is connected to slavery, and what she wrote a lot about is poverty. And so in Kitchenette Building, and if you don't know what a kitchenette building is, it's a tenement, and there were a lot of them in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in Chicago, where families had to share bathrooms. So you're in a different room and everything, but you're sharing the bathroom with another family. And this is a poem that deals with class issues and aesthetic issues. What happens if you like art and you like literature and you have these dreams and aspirations, but you are so poor, you know, you suffer from generational poverty? That is one of the legacies of slavery. You suffer so much from this that you have to worry daily about survival. How can you have a dream when you're worrying about survival? It is a poem about how some people have to perform under adverse conditions. We are things of dry hours and the involuntary plan, grade in and grade, dream makes a giddy sound, not strong like rent, feeding a wife, satisfying a man. But could a dream send up through onion fumes, its white and violet, fight with fried potatoes and yesterday's garbage ripening in the hall, flutter or sing an aria down these rooms? Even if we were willing to let it in, had time to warm it, keep it very clean, anticipate a message, let it begin? We wonder, but not well, not for a minute. Since number 5 is out of the bathroom now, we think of lukewarm water, hope to get in it. So at the end of the poem, that reality of how you're living creeps back in. And so you just can't do the kind of dreaming you would like to dream when you have such a practical need there, you know, listening to hear when the toilet flushes. So you know that now your family has a chance to go in. And then Alice Walker, most of you probably know her more for The Color Purple. She was a poet, short story writer, actively involved in the civil rights movement. My favorite Alice Walker poem is called Women. And I like this poem because it highlights reading and education and what our foremothers did for those of us who are living now, those foremothers who escaped slavery or who were illiterate domestics working in white folks' homes, who were somebody's mammy, even as they were somebody else's mother. So women. They were women then, my mama's generation, husky of voice, stout of step, with fists as well as hands, how they battered down doors and ironed starch white shirts, how they led armies, head rag generals across minefields, booby trap ditches, to discover books, desks, a place for us, how they knew what we must know without knowing a page of it themselves. So, of course, the reference to head rag generals there, she's probably thinking in terms of someone like Harriet Tubman, the abolitionist, the Underground Railroad conductor, the Moses of her people, who made 13 trips to rescue 70 enslaved persons, never losing a passenger. And the story is told how one man who did not want to move forward, and she pulled out her gun and said, "Move forward or die." I saw a sign on Instagram the other day where one Black person was telling another Black person that she never talks politics with someone Harriet Tubman would have left behind. I thought that was kind of funny. And then Nikki Giovanni and her poem, Nikki Rosa. Of course, Nikki Giovanni is associated with the Black arts movement. She moved from writing a lot of revolutionary poetry to love poems, and now she writes a lot of collections for children. A number of these writers write for children too, because they don't want to leave behind the children. And this poem, Nikki Rosa, at one point, Nikki Giovanni, even though she was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, she moved to Cincinnati and then to some other places. I have a number of Ohio writers in this PowerPoint since I'm in Ohio. But this one, Nikki Rosa, is a very nice poem. Childhood remembrances are always a drag if you're Black. You always remember things like living in Woodlawn with no inside toilet. And if you become famous or something, they never talk about how happy you were to have your mother all to yourself and how good the water felt when you got your bath from one of those big tubs that folk in Chicago barbecue in. And somehow when you talk about home, it never gets across how much you understood their feelings as the whole family attended meetings about Hollydale. And even though you remember, your biographers never understand your father's pain as he sells his stock and another dream goes. And although you're poor, it isn't poverty that concerns you. And though they fought a lot, it isn't your father's drinking that makes any difference, but only that everybody is together and you and your sister have happy birthdays and very good Christmases. And I really hope no white person ever has cause to write about me, because they never understand Black love is Black wealth. And they'll probably talk about my hard childhood and never understand that all the while I was quite happy. So sometimes children, when they're poor, never realize how poor they really were until after they grow up. Because when there is warmth in the family and love, and there are all of these family gatherings, you grow up feeling a certain kind of richness, even in your poverty. And then another writer born in Toledo, Ohio, part of the Black Arts movement. One of the things that the video said is that you can't place slavery in some narrow historical box, that it connects to how we live and how we love and how we perform throughout life. And so that's why I have some of these broader topics. This particular poem, what do you do when your lover leaves you? Just when you think that the author is crying the blues over having been left by her lover, you get a surprise at the end of the poem. Where have you gone with your confident walk, with your crooked smile? Why did you leave me? When you took your laughter and departed, are you aware that with you went the sun and light and what few stars there were? Where have you gone with your confident walk, your crooked smile, the rent money in one pocket and my heart in another? So just when you think that she's just being overly romantic, there's this control in the poem. What she's really worried about, yes, you left me, but you took the rent money in the pocket. And then I have some by one of my favorite poets, Lucille Clifton, whose father worked in the steel mills, her mother in a laundry. She wrote a lot of poems about ordinary people. And to circle back to Phyllis Wheatley, she also wrote poems about the desire to actually write poetry. She has a collection on good times, the dignity of family life. She's written a lot of children's books too. But this is a particular poem that she connects to slavery and the beauty aesthetic, because one of the things that slavery did was to superimpose a Eurocentric beauty aesthetic. So many of the African-American, especially the women writers, write stories and poems and novels that challenge a Eurocentric beauty aesthetic. And so they write about hair, and they write about large lips, and they write about skin color, they write about hips. And they do this because one of the things done in slavery is that the Black body, especially the Black women's body, was degraded, discredited, And that's why even in health today, you hear such things as Blacks don't feel pain the same way, and it's the way our bodies were reconstructed during the from the perspective of slave masters. I talk a little about this in another book that I've written called Granny Midwives and Black Women Writers, where I write about how we had all of these Black women who used to deliver thousands of babies, mostly in the South, white and Black babies. But then at some point in history, the white medical establishment convinced people that these Black women had dirty hands, or their hands were like horse hands, and they shouldn't be delivering babies and placing their dirty hands in women's wombs, where the irony was that these women were never doing that, because the metaphor they used was catching babies. They weren't intruding in the womb. In fact, the people who were doing that were the white men when they invented forceps and all. But that's another story. Here's the poem on hips. These hips are big hips. They need space to move around in. They don't fit into little petty places. These hips are free hips. They don't like to be held back. These hips have never been enslaved. They go where they want to go. They do what they want to do. These hips are mighty hips. I have known these hips are magic hips. I have known them to put a spell on a man and spin him like a top. So that the hips and slavery. She has another really good one on hair too, where she talks about how Black hair is like good greens. And then the last author that I want to say something about is Toni Morrison. And I want to end with this Ohio writer and her Ohio story. I don't have to say much about Morrison. I just have to say her name. And of course, many of you know she won the Pulitzer Prize, Nobel Prize, one of the major American writers of all times. I would say, who has done more to remind us of 1619 than Toni Morrison, when she dedicated her novel, Beloved, that came out in 1987. She dedicated it to 60 million and more. And as Newsweek explains, 60 million, it was Morrison's best educated guess at the number of Black Africans who never even made it into slavery. Those who either died as captives in Africa or on the slave ships. And one account says that the Congo River was so clogged that with bodies that the ships could barely pass. So that Morrison and Beloved deals directly with slavery. I have some quotes that she wrote about slavery. Unspeakable things unspoken. That's when she's talking about the middle passage, that very few writers have written anything about the middle passage. Unspeakable things unspoken. And then this definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. That talks about what's at stake when you allow one group to write all the rules. And then she has this statement in Beloved where she tries to give us a feel on what does slavery feel like. That anybody white could take your whole self for anything that came to mind, not just work, kill, or maim you, but dirty you so bad you forgot who you were and couldn't think it up. And then this quote where, if you are free, what's your responsibility? The function of freedom is to free someone else. And I like that. And at the same time, she has all of these on slavery. Many people lose sight that even during slavery, Blacks did try to love one another, whether it's mothers loving children, or fathers loving, or husbands, or men loving the women. And so she's written a lot about love too. And I wanted to have some of these passages because so much of African American literature is about love. And this first one is actually from her first work, The Bluest Eye. Love is never any better than the lover. Wicked people love wickedly. Violent people love violently. Weak people love weakly. Stupid people love stupidly. But the love of a free man is never safe. And then this other one is one of my favorite Toni Morrison passages. This is actually from her book, Song of Solomon. And it's about how this man feels about this woman. The woman is madly in love with the man, but he doesn't return it. And so she's trying to describe that loss of love. And it's a passage where she uses beer as a metaphor. I have never drunk beer, but this passage strikes me as just so accurate. She was the third beer, not the first one, which the throat receives with almost tearful gratitude, nor the second that confirms and extends the pleasure of the first, but the third, the one you drink because it's there, because it can't hurt, and because what difference does it make? And then the last quote is one from Beloved, the book about slavery. And the background to this particular quote, you need to understand the background to this particular quote, because it's spoken by a slave called Sixo, S-I-X-O. And of course, that's a reference to the 60 million that's in the book's epigraph. But he is, he's a slave, he's Black, but he also has Native American roots, because with the landing of the ships in 1619, irreparable damage was also done to indigenous communities. And Sisso, who's speaking here, loves this Black woman. Her real name is Patsy, but the other male slaves call her the 30-mile woman, because Sisso loves her so much that he walks 30 miles to see her at night, escaping from the plantation. But by the time he gets there, it's time to go back and start the day's work at his plantation. So it's very risky business, and that's why they call it the 30-mile woman. So the other Black men want to know, what is it that this woman does for you that you can walk 30 miles to see her and risk everything? And here's his answer. She is a friend of my mind. She gathered me, man, the pieces I am. She gathered them and give them back to me in all the right order. It's good, when you got a woman who is a friend of your mind. A beautiful passage. In the novel, they do catch Sisso and they burn him alive. But as he's being burned to death, he starts yelling out 7-0, 7-0, because he knows that the 30-mile woman is carrying in her womb his soon-to-be baby. African-American writers look back on our history, a history that denied them the right to read and write, but they have contributed to the American canon of letters in ways that would make American literature deficient without their voices. Their writings are as universal as the writings of any of the world's peoples. That is, yes, they have written hundreds of slave narratives and neo-slave narratives, but they also have written every genre possible, covering topics that matter to everyone. In my, in one of the books that I've written, an anthology, I list over 25 major themes that our writers have tackled. And you can see some of them on the screen. Everything from art and imagination, childhood and coming of age, folklore and oral traditions, husbands and lovers, education and life of the mind, interracial friendships and conflicts, and for Halloween, vampires, aliens and sorcerers, women's rights and movements. The video pointed out that nothing is untouched by the legacy of slavery. So you do get all of these themes. African American literature, sure, it's about slavery and bondage, but it's also in the spirit of we shall overcome. And so the topics are as broad and as deep as any body of literature. The bottom line is, if you want to read a literature that is about resistance and resiliency, that covers the full range of human experiences, read African American writers who write literature with pens dipped in the ink of what happened in 1619, but always moving beyond what happened to what is and what can be. Thank you.